We very much appreciate our partnership with the Niles Discovery Church, which provides this really extraordinary space for us and for our community programs. And just a little announcement about the Niles Discovery Church. In this particular time of food insecurity, please know that the Niles Discovery Church maintains what they call the Little Pantry. And it's a small, tall shed in the parking lot. And it's open 24/7 for people to come and get food if they need it. So any non-perishable food items are greatly accepted to help those in need. Now I want to say a brief word about the League. The League of Women Voters, as many of you know, has been in existence for more than 100 years, and it's been in our community in Fremont-Newark-Union City for more than 50 years. Our mission is to encourage active participation in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and we influence public policy through study, education, and advocacy. We invite you to join, whether you're a woman, a female, or a male. We have a lot of male members. We invite you to join. It's important to understand that we have a nonpartisan policy. The League never endorses or opposes a particular candidate or a particular political party. But this is important. Once a person is no longer a candidate, once they've been elected, they are no longer a candidate and they become a public servant. They're responsible for representing all of their constituents, regardless of party affiliation. Holding elected officials accountable to the public interest is not a partisan act. It is a vital function of a healthy democracy. So the League is not, we're nonpartisan, but we're not neutral. We do not stay silent when democracy is under threat, voter access is restricted, or misinformation spreads. When these things happen, the League has a responsibility to speak out clearly and forcefully. I'm going to talk just a little bit about today's format. Many of you have been here before, and we have a particular format, but today's format is a little bit different. Our moderator will begin the conversation with our two guests, and at times during the conversation, the moderator will ask for audience questions, and that's why this microphone is set up in the middle here. And the reason for that is we used to, people would raise their hand with questions and we'd run around with mics, but we don't have enough mics today. So we had to do this, and I hope it works out well. So if you have questions or comments, please walk up to the microphone. If you can feel free to create a line, it doesn't have to be one question per, and then sit down and then the next person. You can create a line. So with that, now we're on to our program. Let's take note of what we see on the screen here. This is the very simple yet elegant language of our First Amendment to the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's it. That's our First Amendment. Simple and elegant and meaningful. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So with that, we'll introduce our speakers. Evelyn's going to do that.
First of all, I want to thank the two speakers for accepting our invitation. We sent out notices to many, many people. And hopefully they're in the courts fighting for our freedoms, because we were glad that Alex accepted and then he recommended Thomas. Alex Emslie is Senior Editor of Talent and Development at KQED, where he mentors early career journalists. He received the Society of Professional Journalists NorCal Chapter Award for Podcast Journalism in 2021. He was a consulting editor of the KQED NPR podcast series that probed the police misconduct, accountability, and oversight system in California. He has worked as an investigative journalist focusing on criminal justice, policing, and the courts. He has a deep commitment to civic accountability that is holding power to account. From his experience in the field, no doubt he understands the pressures on public interest journalism and the challenges of misinformation and the shrinking newsroom. Thomas Peele is an investigative reporter at EdSource, a nonprofit news organization focused on education in California. He has a track record of holding institutions accountable and has won a Pulitzer Prize for breaking news reporting as part of the East Bay Times team that covered the 2016 Ghost Ship fire. He is the author of Killing the Messenger, a story of radical faith, racism's backlash, and the assassination of a journalist, which examines the murder of Oakland journalist Chauncey Bailey. The book explores the dangers faced by those who pursue truth. His reporting has exposed corruption, abuse of power, and failures of government accountability. Both journalists are gatekeepers, storytellers, and truth seekers who have illuminated threats to transparency and democracy. I'm sure they'll expound upon our first question. And we'll start with Alex. And we're going to ask both of them, what do you see as the major First Amendment issues facing the American public today as relates to speech and the press? And then Dave Fishbaugh will take over as moderator and ask some prepared questions, as well as we're taking questions from the audience. So if something strikes your fancy and you have a question, then just line up at the microphone. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that really nice introduction, and thank you for having us both here. In part, I recommended Tom because we worked together for a couple of years, very intensively, and but that was a few years ago, and I don't get to see him as often anymore. So this is nice to just kind of come together and talk about something that I know we both have a lot to say about and a lot of energy for. The initial question is pretty broad, and it caused me to ponder pretty hard about how I would just start our conversation and answer it. And I think that you could go to several different places, right? I think there's one that's very much on the surface, which is that there is a president and a presidential administration right now that is creating sort of unique challenges for traditional and established media organizations, news organizations, including the one that I work for, which is, public media. But I wanted to go a little bit sort of to a broader, idea, which is that I think the biggest threat facing the First Amendment as it pertains to freedom of speech in the press right now is fear and cowardice on the part of many different actors from different kind of positions in this system. And I think that the protections that the First Amendment guarantees are only really as good as there are people who work for institutions who are willing to stand up for those protections. And I think we've had some failures to do that, which has led to a potential threat or erosion of confidence in that we're even going to be able to preserve these really important freedoms that the First Amendment guarantees. So that's the beginning of my answer, and I think I'll pass over to Tom.
Thank you, Alex, and hello, everybody. It's certainly an honor to be invited to speak to such an august organization as the League of Women Voters, such a bulwark of our democracy. One thing that wasn't in my introduction is I've had a lot of at another point in my career, experience one-on-one with the current president of the United States. I was a city hall reporter in Atlantic City, New Jersey for most of the 90s, when you probably all remember that the president owned some very gaudy and fairly poorly run casinos. And he was always highly critical of any coverage of those casinos that wasn't laudatory, to say the least. So the president and I had more than a few shouting matches over coverage. At the time, he was attempting to acquire a large piece of municipal land from the city to build yet another casino, and there were a lot of problems with what he was offering. People didn't want to deal with it, and he didn't get it, and he was very angry. If you had told me then that he would be, 20 years later, President of the United States, I just would have laughed. What scares me in particular as a news gatherer about where he is going are two things. He has long talked about a reversal of American libel law. And by that, he is talking about something I'm sure that you all know about. There's a Supreme Court decision called New York Times versus Sullivan, in which the court held that malice had to be provable and actual with foreknowledge of malice in a news publication in order for a libel case to be brought. Trump wants to reverse that decision. He's wanted to reverse that decision for years because he only wants to be covered by sycophants who will praise him. He doesn't like real, honest coverage at all. The other Supreme Court case that I worry about with him, not one that he's articulated much about, but it's the Pentagon Papers case. The idea of the government stopping a news organization from publishing a story, prior restraint. It's unheard of in our country. It's happened one time after the Pentagon Papers, and that was a alternative paper in Atlanta that got the makings of a nuclear bomb and was going to publish them. Trump doesn't articulate that, but I fear we're going to see at some point in this administration where the New York Times, the Washington Post, ProPublica has a very critical story of him. They take the standard journalistic move of going to the White House and asking for a response, and then all of a sudden doors of newsrooms start to be kicked in, and Kash Patel and his minions are ripping computers off of desks. I may be over the top with that, but it scares me as a journalist. Those, I think, are the two big picture things that I worry the most about.
Alex, any more on that topic? Or question?
Well, I just agree that those are legitimate concerns at this time, and part of the reason that I would back up the concern about the Pentagon Papers case and the idea that an all but all out prohibition on prior restraint is maybe somewhat in question, is this idea of and this is not necessarily unique to the Trump administration, but the tendency of those in power to want to control what is said about them and any kind of, what is basically written in the press, but also we're here to talk about general freedom of expression, freedom of speech on the part of any member of the public. Newsflash, there's not a lot of differences in terms of special rights that journalists have. I think more it's just a learned practice to use the rights tool that we all necessarily have to try to hold, at the best when we do our best, we try to hold the government accountable. And I think so. The tendency of those in power to want to control what is said about them is not necessarily unique. The level of desire for control is, I think, special with our current administration, and that gives rise to concern.
So I'd like you to think back, perhaps to your youth, when you first learned about journalism and path for you. And when did you first have of amendment to the Constitution? Start with Tom.
Well, I am old enough to have taken civics classes in high school. They're not.
No.
Yes.
There it is. How's that?
Could I also comment? You all might, not only mics, but speak a little bit louder too.
Okay.
Wouldn't hurt.
Thank you. So we're saying I'm old enough to have taken a civics class or two in high school. Please, if you know of a high school that has civics classes now, please tell me. Because we should talk.
It's a required class for graduation.
Yeah, but look at what's being taught within the particular curricula. So, very short story on the genesis of my career. I went to college without a lot of focus. Wanted to play baseball, wanted to do some things, was invited to leave some very mediocre institutions of higher learning, and ended up back in the town where I grew up in the middle of winter when there were very few jobs. My father looked at me and said a few words and ended it. I won't tell you what it began with, but it ended with, go get a job. So I saw an ad for a little weekly newspaper that they wanted a production assistant. Well, the picking was rather thin, so I went over to the newspaper, and the guy who owned it had started it himself because he didn't like policy of public water policy in the town where he lived. He wanted public water in his neighborhood rather than well water. The well water was somewhat polluted. So he started a free weekly newspaper. Gave it away. Production assistant sort of began with a broom in the back room where he printed the press himself. And the man was a retired stock car driver, and he was sort of mechanically brilliant. And the building the newspaper was in didn't have the right wiring for a printing press. So he rigged up a printing press that ran on a Ford Pinto engine on blocks. Yeah. So my first duties were to sweep, to bundle the newspapers on the 2 days that they were printed, and to make the weekly gasoline run, to fill up a couple of jerry cans so we could make it through the press run. And to change the plugs and points occasionally on the Ford Pinto engine. So rather than taking a traditional route to journalism and being handed a AP style book, I was handed the operations manual for the engine, the user's manual for the Ford Pinto. But after a month or so, I convinced him, hey, maybe you need a sports section and I can start writing some stories. Having no idea whatsoever how to do that. But it worked. And in about a year, I went back as an undergraduate, finished a degree, ended up at Newsday, the big paper on Long Island, in high school sports, and then wandered off to the wild of New Jersey to begin being a news reporter.
Alex.
To be honest, I do not remember when I first became cognizant of the First Amendment, and I think the reason is that I had, my mom's a public school teacher, retired, second grade. My dad has read every book that he could ever get his hands And they both, I think, so from before I had like a conscious formation of memory, these concepts, including concepts that are sort of central to our idea of liberty in the United States, were very much kind of just part of my upbringing. But I do remember, so I'll reference high school, because I had an experience that to be honest, we had history, we had American government. I don't know if we had the sort of the traditional civics curriculum at that time or not. I don't know if they would count. But what we did have, which is also more rare these days, was a high school newspaper. And I found my way there, like I think a lot of people might, at any time, wanting to, frankly, to write, to learn to report, and kind of find a direction for my life toward the end of high school. And it was in that process. This was in the early 2000s. First semester on the high school newspaper was the September 11th attacks, I remember. Watching that in the high school newsroom. They did not deploy us to go cover that as high school journalists in Colorado. But it affected me. And I remember by the end of my time at that high school, at that newspaper, called the Tenderfoot Times, I was doing things like this. I was the editor-in-chief of that paper, and I was invited to speak about things like the initiation of the Iraq War to the kind of local chapter of, could have been the League of Women Voters at that time in the early 2000s, now over 2 decades ago. And I really liked all that was happening there. I liked the idea to be able to independently assess information that was being given. And it is both still to this day horrifying to me, and at the same time really satisfying to be able to watch official statements being made by people of immense sort of accomplishment and power and responsibility for the rest of us, and to know that those statements are false, and to feel like you are the one who has a responsibility and a capability to sort of correct that narrative. I don't know if this was supposed to be like an advertisement for journalism, but that is one of the most personally satisfying things that I've always found, is to be able to be in that position. Starts from a very kind of fear, a negative reaction, but it's so cool to be able to say, I'm sorry, this is what the truth is. And so it's really then that I feel like I started to recognize the First Amendment as a tool. And I still, to this day, feel like I'm still learning it. Because even though it's the simple words that we say on the screen, even from its inception, it has been debated as to what exactly those words mean. What are the limits on individual freedom of expression? What are the limits on when the press is irresponsible as an independent actor from government? What are the limits on government to react or sort of stop the efforts of the press when it is acting assertively? I do have a historical reference, and maybe this is a good time to show it. This is one of my favorite quotes about journalism from the author of the First Amendment, James Madison. And as a little bit of context, one of the favorite things that I've learned about the First Amendment was that it is an amendment. It was an afterthought. And the architect of the Constitution, James Madison, was actually pretty reticent to include a Bill of Rights, including what became the First Amendment, for a number of different reasons. But this quote came from a decade or two after the Constitution had been enacted, and just really a few short years after the First Amendment was put in place, when a presidential administration, John Adams, passed, and Congress passed and signed into law the Alien and Sedition Acts. And this is really about sedition. And to just simplify, what that law allowed was for the presidential administration at the time to basically jail its critics, reporters, journalists, and it was a lot more opinionated at the time too, but those within opinion publishing it, that was critical of what the presidential administration was doing. Well, at that time, at least for a few short years, they went to jail. And so I think at that time, James Madison had become more aware of the importance of that protection being written down as an affirmative defense in the Constitution as the First Amendment. I like what he says here because he starts out acknowledging that not everything in the news is going to be something that you agree with or is going to be something that's done well, right? There's a reference here to the noxious branches and the licentiousness of the press sometimes. But I think there's a follow-up to this quote, which is that among those abuses, the negative side, this is the only way that humans can have these ideas of liberty and freedom to themselves, is if they are able to express their ideas without fear of repression from those in power. And I think then he goes on to say, there's maybe one more here. Oh, a couple more. So if all that's true, then can the federal government, if it feels like there's a greater good served by coming down on the press, does it not have a way to do that? And it's a rhetorical question because he's got an answer to it, and I think that's the last of these slides here. Which is basically, let's check the Constitution. If it's not a power granted to the federal government, and above all, if it is expressly forbidden by a declaratory amendment to the Constitution, the answer must be that the federal government is destitute of all such authority to censor the press.
So I think we had an audience question a few moments ago.
The background you provided, each of you, was interesting, and thank you for that. You inserted that following your introduction, talking about 2 court cases, and I am following the current events closely, and I have to admit, well, the one I had heard of one of those court cases, but was not familiar in detail with them. But one that I have been following very closely is the Pentagon kicking out all of the reporters. Now, trying to tie all these things together in a legal context can be a little bit complicated. And it goes beyond legal context because there's a political context. So legal and or political, what do you think the actions taken by Hegseth and Trump at the Pentagon forebodes relative to broader, I mean, they always seem to have some kind of a test case to see what they can get away with. And so what do you think this forebodes? Hard to predict for any of us, but maybe you're in a better position to do so. Thank you.
Thank you for that deep question, sir. So let's back up couple of steps away from Hegseth. I'm sure some of you have gone to public meetings, right? City council, school board, county. We have this lovely thing in California called the Brown Act, which means you get to go and you get to be there and it has to happen in public. That's wonderful on the local level. Ain't no Brown Act in the federal government. Nothing like it. And one of the things that we see is that despite this idea that reporters are completely free to do what they want, and we are, there can still be limits from public agencies, especially federal agencies, on who gets to do what, when, and where. Stepping aside from Hegseth's completely onerous policy, there has been military censorship of the press throughout American history. Wilson hated the press. Roosevelt a lot of restrictions in World War II, and a lot of public pressure that at wartime is not a time to criticize the military. We saw that in the culture wars coming out of Vietnam, where there was a great deal of pressure from young leftists against the war, and there were a lot of older Americans who were highly critical of reportage that was perceived to be negative about American policy during the war. All that said, the situation with the federal government is terrible. I believe that only one news source, a right-wing sycophant operation out of San Diego, agreed to Hegseth's completely onerous press policies covering the Pentagon. And frankly, I'd be more worried if anybody else was able, or anybody else had, any other news organizations had agreed, than I am about a failure of the news organizations that rejected the policy to still be able to aggressively cover the Pentagon. That level of journalist, the Times, the Post, the Journal, they will get the job done regardless of this policy. They have sources, they have longstanding histories with people in the military, and you can see that a lot of the major players in the Defense Department, all of those generals that they summoned for that meeting a month or so ago, they understand they are not to be politicized. That if there's one branch of the government that shouldn't be politicized, it is the military. And you're still seeing good coverage out of the Times and the Post and some of the major TV stations about the Pentagon. And I think that will continue. And I think that this policy will only turn the American public further away from the administration. I mean, that said, I don't think you can also, most reporters can walk into the Department of Agriculture and ask questions now. But I think very aggressive journalism will continue on the administration, and it'll work.
You hope, I want to hope, that whoever might be in whichever position of power or authority, I think we depend on sort of an appeal to their adherence or their respect to higher ideals. Because look, if I'm Pete Hegseth, or to some degree if I'm Donald Trump, there's very little personal benefit to allowing an aggressive or assertive adversarial press to operate freely, right? And so you want to hope that whoever may be in that position of power is able to see sort of a greater good in otherwise not serving their own self-interest. And I don't have that confidence in the current administration, but I'll say that past administrations and representatives of other political parties have also kind of let me down in the hopes of adherence to the higher ideals, right? So it goes back to what Tom is saying, in that part of being a journalist, at least in terms of talking about freedom of the press, is that you don't get a lot of favors from the people in power that you're trying to hold accountable. You need to figure out ways to creatively get information that's in the public interest, regardless if they block it or not. And I have less of a direct concern about access to, just sort of general access for reporters to the Pentagon than I do about general access for reporters to the Oakland Police Department, which has adopted some of the same tactics about deciding that they're going to choose who they will issue police department accreditation for in order to cover police department news that they hold press conferences for. I don't know if it's, I have questions as to whether that is legal or whether it should be. But my analysis so far is that the state of the law on that particular issue, which Tom, I think, was alluding to some here, is that if any government, federal, state, or local, is in sort of control of it's their space and their message, you don't necessarily, particularly space, less message, journalists don't necessarily have a guaranteed right of access to that, or the government entity does have a somewhat of a right to control their own space and the way that they message. So it's concerning, and it is not the kind of values that I wish leadership upheld, but it's kind of par for the course in terms of how power operates at whatever level you're thinking these days.
Okay, we'd be happy to take additional questions from the audience if there are some. Moment. Okay.
I got all kinds of questions. What impact could you foresee on the motivation and of the press to be aggressive if courts, and the courts are in the middle of it right now, come to the conclusion that it's at the president's sole discretion as to when, whether, and where to deploy troops? Will that put a blanket on reporters by virtue of now there are military squads out there that if a reporter's out there could, it's a fearsome thing.
It can't put a blanket on our efforts, but it's not something that I welcome at all. I am in a position at my news organization where it could very well be me, but that was sort of maybe in years past that I would be the one who would be on the streets facing potential confrontation or danger in those kind of situations. These days, in some ways, it's harder because I am deploying earlier career journalists who are earlier in their career in some degrees, or anyway, other people out into the kind of situation where, if I understand your question right, it's like the kind of on the ground reporting where we have the U.S. military deployed in a in domestic space in an American city, and covering how that plays out. And I think, just to be explicit about it, one of the concerns that I have around that is that something goes badly, right? That there is an eruption of violence in some kind of way, because as I understand, I've never served in the armed forces, but sort of the perpetuation of force is kind of at the core of what they do. So it scares me, but the short answer to the question is that I think anybody who's in this line of work knows, or should know, that we can't back down in that situation. We have to figure out a way to cover it. But what it will mean is a greater level of threat to the people who are doing this work.
Quick follow-up. Maybe so, but then you've got the heads of the news corporations like ABC being, putting it bluntly, chicken shit and paying $16 million. If you're a journalist at ABC, in the industry broader, but particularly if you're at ABC, you're going to wonder whether you're going to get the backing.
I think that's a fair piece of criticism, sir. Thank you. I think it's a very fair piece of criticism. I think chicken shit's a good word for what ABC did, and I can think of a few more that I won't offer in polite company. When they caved, because George Stephanopoulos did absolutely nothing wrong. He didn't slander anybody. He was a journalist doing his job, and they folded under this ridiculous threat of Trump's weaponizing the FCC. to the street, reporters are going to go. You go and look at the coverage of when the Marines went into Los Angeles a couple of months ago. There were reporters getting hurt down there. There were people getting shot with rubber bullets. And I can tell you, I got nicked with a wooden dowel once at a protest at the Port of Oakland and got the crap knocked out of me one time by a couple of guys who didn't like me talking into a cell phone in Oakland, reporting to an editor what I was seeing when I was seeing the looting of the Sears building after Johannes Messerly was acquitted in the Oscar Grant case. Reporters will go out there. Now, I'm old now. I don't know if I'm going to go out there, but reporters will go out there. You don't have to worry about that. Maybe with ABC and because of that, but I think locally, things here, there were reporters flooding the zone at Coast Guard Island last week when it looked like they were coming. Job will get done.
Have another audience question?
Thank you for coming to our little town of Fremont that's mostly neglected, like you. Thank you.
A little closer to the mic, Jen.
Okay, thanks for coming. Can you hear me? Well, my question is, I think a lot of people here do support the journalists. What I want to know is what else we can do to protect our free speech rights. We see protests you're talking about. We see people become a citizen and still getting hauled off, and all of the stuff that you've mentioned. We would like some action.
I think you're Fremont not getting attention anymore when it used to, when you used to have your own paper as part of various conglomerates. I think it's a tragedy. There was a paper in Fremont, there's a paper in Hayward, there's a paper in Alameda, there's a paper in Oakland. Were they common? Were there a lot of common stuff? Yeah, but did you have a reporter at your city council meeting? You did, for the most part, 10 years ago. I don't know if you do now, but I want to offer one thing that everybody can do, one piece of advice. Please pay for your news, whether you're making a donation to KQED,
Or EdSource.
whether you're supporting our education coverage at EdSource, or whether you're paying for a subscription to the San Francisco Chronicle or the San Jose Mercury News, and I know getting print with it is now an audacious cost, but please support the news organizations that remain and are trying to do the job. And when somebody comes into Fremont and starts a Fremont local news website, if there isn't one, and forgive me for not knowing if there is, please support it. We get nowhere if we're not getting read and if there's not some kind of revenue stream to keep people doing what we do.
A little something to add to that too. I agree. And you know, KQED has, I'll get into this if there's a follow-up question, but there's been this idea of somewhat softer pressure through the business model or through funding is something that public media has experienced on multiple fronts right now. But in terms of action items, and I want to go back to what I was first thinking about, what are the major First Amendment issues facing us today, and that I have this idea of it, that it's fear or cowardice. I had the settlement from ABC and others in mind, thinking that our news organizations and really the corporate sides of them, because by the way, that wasn't any editor or editorial people making those decisions to enter into those settlements, right? There's generally a firewall within any of these organizations between those who are doing the work that you read and those who operate the kind of corporate end of things. And those folks are generally motivated by, by business interests, and to some degree by keeping businesses alive. So they're not easy questions to answer, right? But there has been a trend for some time of people being less and less inclined to speak to our reporters about any given issue and to put their name behind it, to basically be on the record with their full name. And I want to exclude people who are facing like legitimate threats to their safety or particular, immigration enforcement is one that we deal with a lot. But if you don't have a particular imminent threat to your safety, please speak up and put your name behind it. Speak your opinion. Use the rights that are granted to you by the First Amendment of freedom of speech, including if a journalist asks you a question and wants to hear, your thoughts on a particular issue, whether it be local, state, or national. There has been what feels like a pernicious and dangerous trend toward a mistrust of the press, and I get it. I know about the noxious branches, right? I know that there is the sort of the worst of our industry that we are sometimes going to be seen as. But there is also so much greater good, positive good mixed in with people speaking their mind. And we have both, and we're far from the only ones, been privileged to take those kind of comments, to take information from people who were brave enough to give it and have it have real impact in our world, in people's lives. That's a really good feeling too. I'm getting a little shaky as I'm saying that because I'm so proud to be in a place to be able to facilitate that kind of expression. And that's, by the way, really what I see the one basic definition of what we should do as journalists is not judge people's points of view, but defend to the death and be really assertive in our efforts to facilitate those viewpoints going out so everybody can hear them, everybody can see them, and make their own decisions about what they mean and whether they agree or disagree with them. So speak up. Thank you.
Okay. Let's take your question, please. It's brief.
Yeah, it's just about a new book out that just came out in March this year by David Enright called Murder the Truth, First Amendment and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. And it speaks to what we're talking about today and gives a heck of a lot of history. And I just really wanted to thank all of you and the League for putting this on. It's really important. And for people that just want more back information, especially like how the New York Times has been out so much money in defending libel suits. So, this history is worth knowing. So thank you. And I'm glad you're here giving us more history and context. Murder the Truth, the First Amendment and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful by David Enright.
Thank you.
Yeah, indeed.
Kind of a question. So that the First Amendment applies to Congress making, et cetera. What about all these corporations that are buying up all the media sources? I mean, you can have fact, but it's basically like I can.
Mm-hmm.
Been
Well,
my concern.
That's the problem. That is a legitimate problem. You all, I know, remember the Fremont-Argus, right? Wish it was still here because every city deserves its own local news organization. The company that owned the Fremont-Argus is now, through various iterations, is a hedge fund called Alden Global Capital. Alden Global Capital has decided that none of its newspapers may endure across the country, and they own a lot. They have decided that they will not endorse presidential candidates. Everything is local. The Chicago Tribune will not endorse a presidential candidate. They want to stay out of it. It's all about the money. So the fact is, corporations owning news organizations come fraught with challenges. We see it with ABC, as the gentleman has alluded, be it with Alden. It takes a larger commitment. The future is going to be new models. It's going to be nonprofits like the one that I work for, nonprofit now covering news in Oakland. Cal Matters, I hope you've all heard of it. Statewide coverage, does an excellent job. They're philanthropic models. The Philadelphia Inquirer, a great newspaper, is now philanthropically owned and thriving in Philadelphia. That's where we need to go. We need to move away from corporate ownership unless the corporation, like the family that owns the New York Times, is committed long-term to the journalism.
Are you saying in order to have local coverage, or is that in general?
I guess in general, but it's also local coverage. You don't have a newspaper here because Alden Global Capital consolidated every paper into the East Bay Times. Now, do you have the East Bay Times here? Yes. But do you have a dedicated reporter in Fremont? I don't think so. The last dedicated reporter in Fremont was a guy named Joe Jiha when I was still at the East Bay Times 5 years ago.
Works at KQED now.
Good for him because he's better paid.
Yeah.
Please ask your question.
Actually, my question is very similar. I'm just wondering, what do you guys foresee as the future when you look at people that are loyalists to Trump, like Jeff Bezos, who owns Washington Post? I'm just wondering, because how accurate are things going to be? I mean, are we going to be leaning more towards a state-run media now? Are we going to, what do you guys foresee as the future? And I'm just wondering how journalists feel about that now.
I am concerned about all of the above. I do think that the nonprofit model is one that is less inclined to. It's better set up to be protected, to remain independent. But nonprofits, we often drop, they're nonprofit corporations, right? Which really just means that revenue is still important, right? We have to be able to, the institutions as broader based companies still need to survive. There's quite a proliferation of more kind of singular, independent people, freelancing, writing, creating their own audiences on the internet. There's this sort of new frontier of new media. And I have respect for that because it's all good. It's all freedom of expression. But the type of work that we have done relies on an established institution. And I think that you definitely lose something if you say, well, we just don't need those anymore, which I don't know if that sentiment is alive and well in this room, but it's certainly alive and well in a lot of places and a lot of people's minds, I think. This idea that the podcasts and the Substack folks will kind of take the place of the legacy newspapers, broadcast news organizations.
You think they will, or you don't think
I think that idea is out there.
Oh, it is.
And I think that whether they will or whether they will be able to, in some ways depends on whether our society is willing to give up what would be lost in that trade-off. The podcasts, those that are successful, and there's plenty that aren't that you don't really hear about, but those that are making, there's a lot of growth in that sort of area, that there's a lot of money to be made there if you can have a successful product that builds an audience and gets, a lot of people subscribing to it. And most news organizations of the sort of established traditional kind, mine, I don't know if your current one is doing this or not, but they're trying to branch into that space as well. And that's all well and good. I'm not sure if I'm answering your follow-up or not, but I'm trying to, in a sense that I think that the answer to your question, will that become the only news, is one that our society is grappling with right now. But I think if that is what happens, then we are losing something significant and important. Because I, at KQED, don't really want to phrase this way. Let me try that again. KQED has a greater ability to force accountability through litigation than a podcaster does. because we are an established news organization with a legal department with some experience doing that. And so, and that's just one example, and I'm sure if I thought about it, or we collectively thought about it, we could come up with many more of the one does not necessarily, in my mind, replace the other. So it's a struggle. It has always been, since I've been in the news business, because Tom predates me, but I was in really 2010 or so. It has always been the story that the traditional sort of business model is on fire. Nobody's going to get a job. It's all going under, right? And yet we've continued to survive and actually do some pretty good work. So I don't want to, say doom and gloom. At the same time, those business-related pressures, the revenue pressures, are the greatest that they've ever been. And it's not really, in the past, that you could say it was more due to the economic pressures. What public media is facing right now is like economic pressures that are a direct result of actions by the Trump administration. That is the rescission of federal funding to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which hit NPR's pocketbook, hit their revenue. It hit KQED's revenue, and some of my colleagues don't work there anymore as somewhat of a direct result. But it hits much bigger, in a much bigger way, smaller public radio stations around the country, which are closing or are going to close up shop because of that federal revenue was basically their operating budget. That is not true for an institution like KQED. It's a much smaller piece of the pie. Another thing that is, just because I wandered into that topic, I'll mention briefly. I think the rescission from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting funding, that's well known. I think potentially lesser known is FCC investigations into underwriting that funds public media. It's hard for me to not draw a connection to the idea that the Trump administration is very unfavorable of public media, and the idea that the FCC would suddenly come up with this idea to put all major public media stations through a significant audit that cost a ton of money to comply with. And to the best of my knowledge, has found no problems with the way that sort of sponsorship of public media is announced on the airwaves. This is what they call underwriting. And there are some specific rules about what those can say and what they can't say and the tone of them as it pertains to make a distinction between commercial advertising. Again, to the best of my knowledge, no public media station anywhere has broken that rule, and yet many of the larger ones face significant economic hit to comply with an investigation from the FCC, which again had a direct result of some of my colleagues don't work at my workplace anymore. And so these kind of business models is not the most fun thing to think about, but it is true. Like it's important in terms of the sort of relative health of our news ecosystem.
Okay. All righty.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
let me say something here. We have only 15 minutes left. We have prepared questions, and we have audience questions. So you've had enough time. Okay?
Thank you. This chapter of the League of Women Voters supports something called the Youth Voter Movement. We have worked since 2018 and registered almost 14,000 young 18 to 16-year-old pre-registered voters. I notified all of our high school newspapers that you were going to be here this morning. Unfortunately, I don't think any of them are here. EdSource and KQED, and I'm a sustaining member of both, do important work. And how do we reach out to our young people? Part of what we do with our voter registrations, which are led by student leaders in the high school, is to do a civics component during our registration presentations, so the students can get an idea in their head that this is an important function for them too. I'm a retired DOJ lawyer. I spent 40 years in the Department of Justice, and yes, the current administration is weaponizing the entire executive branch of the government against anybody who isn't Donald Trump and the Heritage Foundation. So we need to explain to young people, are your organizations working with student journalists? You caught the fire in high school. We've got to get young people involved too. That's how we got the 22nd Amendment, because I helped do that.
Thank you for that. A couple of weeks ago, I talked to seniors and sophomores and then seniors at one of my kids' high school in San Francisco. And I think that part of the answer for this is we have to convince the next generation that this is a sustainable occupation, that it is vital, and quite frankly, it can be a hell of a lot of fun sometimes. You know? And you get tangible results occasionally. I remember being a young reporter in New Jersey and finding out a mayor that I was covering had gotten $5,000 for something he didn't do out of the city government. And eventually, my reporting forced him to return the money and then revealed a whole rat's nest of other stuff that was going on with turned into millions of dollars. That, you know, there's a sense of satisfaction with doing that kind of reporting.
There's nothing like it.
I will talk to any civics class, any high school newspaper group, anybody that I can talk to with young people about this, and urge it as a potential vocation for them. I taught for 15 years at Berkeley, part-time at the journalism school. We were talking about one young reporter we both know at the San Francisco Chronicle who came through some of my teaching recently. She's fantastic. We need more of them. We do need the young people. First off, they understand this tech stuff a hell of a lot more than I do. But they also, I think, need some of the fundamental lessons of what a reporter does and how they do it. I, for one, am more than willing to provide it to them.
In some ways, I feel like I'm delighted to have a really positive answer to part of that question, which is that both EdSource, as far as I understand, and certainly KQED, as I directly know, have, like, we're teaching hospitals. We have a robust internship program that gets people pretty darn young. Now, not really high school so much, but as soon as they're out of high school, early in college, to people who are not in college, but in their, late teens, early 20s. We are consistently cycling through a dozen or so, two times a year, through a very kind of, strongly administrated, deep, hands-on experience to hopefully get them to catch the bug, to be serious professional journalists and make that step in their career. KQED also has a youth program where there are, kids involved who are much younger, all across the elementary into middle school, junior, and high school. That get kind of exposed to, what it is to be in media and news media through the Youth Takeover program, it's called. So I'm really proud of all of that. There's always more that we can do. And I'm channeling a different question to a little bit to get to like a tangible action item, but I think Tom was referring to this a little bit too. One of the things that I encounter a lot when I'm working with folks from a younger, folks who are a little younger, is there's a different level of respect or understanding for the inclusion of a variety of different viewpoints. And so I'm not, I'm not trying to debate. I get into a lot of these debates as to what is truth versus what is subjective and all of that without even going there. Just trying to encourage maybe the people that you know who maybe they're young kids themselves or they have young kids to do what my parents did and establish, it doesn't matter what anybody necessarily believes, but a sort of a respect for a diversity of opinion. That'll go a long way into getting people more interested in being journalists who, unless you're working for an organization that are ones that I don't necessarily respect, objectivity is going to be a baseline requirement for it.
So with this thing called the internet and the preponderance of consumers of news that are tending to gain access to news through social media and how various algorithms can impact that with misinformation and disinformation. This must be a challenge to traditional and legacy media, and how do you cope with that?
I appreciate your question, I understand, but I don't know that it necessarily comes up that much, if I understand what you're getting at in terms of confronted with like misinformation on social media and that's difficult. And part of the reason that I don't think it comes up all that much is because the way that we work in my newsroom is we're not going to report something just because we saw it on social media, right? That there is a very quick triggering of, well, we got to check this out. Do we have this verified? How do we advance this? Can we corroborate this? Can we confirm this? These words are shouted across our newsroom. Oftentimes it's in like DM Slack messages these days, but and I like to shout them as well all the time. And so those levels, those layers, somewhat prevent difficulty in terms of any specific case that I can think of from arising. But that, getting back to the thing we were talking about earlier about what's the difference between, that is the kind of thing that those standards, that standard of work before we're coming out with something. The New York Times has that tagline, all the news that's fit to print. There's plenty of news that is not fit to print because we don't know if it's right yet, right? And that's what I think, that kind of standard is what we lose if we toss out the organizations and the sort of more traditional approach to news gathering and news reporting and say, well, look, the podcast and the social media sphere kind of has this handled. Sure, but for me as a consumer, I know that I can trust it a heck of a lot less in terms of whether it's true and accurate.
Hey, Judy?
I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this, but I want to ask you to think about old people. I'm 85 years old. I'm a lefty liberal. I read the New York Times as long as I can read it until I sometimes cry and I can't continue it. I think this is a little overdramatic, but I thank God for KQED. I increased my pledge to KQED. I send money to the American Civil Liberties Union, and I went and stood up, and no more kings. But I don't think I'm alone. I just despair. And what do you want to say to people like us? There's a lot of people here. We are so damn aware, and we are so frightened. And what can we do? I mean, I'll go out and get arrested. I'll do whatever. But what?
Please don't.
Don't get
And
arrested.
I want to tell the audience, if you don't watch the news on KQED or listen to it at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the radio, if you don't send money to KQED, do it. You don't have to be rich. Send them some money, okay?
That was. I'm going to tell my boss's boss's boss that you said all that. It's very kind of you to say thank you. Can I just real quick on I'm what you said about how you despair, the level of fear you feel. That touches me a little bit, and I just want to say that I mean part of why I put up the John Adams, James Madison writing about John Adams stuff is to try to keep a little bit of the crisis in context. We are an experiment in self-governance that has always been in crisis since inception. Part of the failure of news, not my news, not the news that Thomas writes, but of a particular kind of approach that I think gained a lot of traction in the 90s and whatever, that sells fear and sensationalism. Right? This is sort of a negative outcome of the worst of our business, is keeping people in a constant state of fear about things that are potentially not as threatening as we may present them as. So I just wanted to say, it's going to be okay. But these issues are serious, and but we're working on them. I know you will. I know you will.
So my one comment is, I do trust KQED, and there are certain other places. I do read at Source, but is there another place that we can sometime read or check? Let's say, like I like to read the Democratic Press. I like to read some of these other smaller local newspapers because it's not very many around here. Or the Press Democrat, sorry. The one I read is the Press Democrat, but it's not always like, sometimes I wonder, are there any others that are local for the smaller, like you say, like the local? I find out more the local stuff from them, for down here even sometimes. Is there some place I can look to check on?
You know, I talk to the city editor of the East Bay Times almost every day, even though I haven't worked there in 5 years, and constantly kicking around ideas because he's got young reporters and he wants to know what I think sometimes, which I don't know if I'm helpful or not. But you are in a bit of a vacuum here, or a bit of a news desert, I think, with the end of the Argus and the East Bay Times not really covering the southern part of the county, and the Mercury News not bleeding over very far into Alameda County in local coverage, even though they are the exact same operation. Again, when somebody starts a Fremont local website, support it. You need it. In the meantime, go to your city council meetings, go to your school board meetings. See something cool at the school board meeting, send me an email. I know it's a bad situation. I mean, the Chronicle covers Alameda County fairly well, I think.
Yeah, I maybe had a slightly different understanding or take on your question. If it's about news in Fremont, I mean, I'll just make the same, statements about my news organization. We will cover happenings in Fremont sometimes, but I think that we can always do more. We're spread pretty thinly across the 9-county Bay Area in terms of our local news coverage. But I liked your question because it's something that I tell people about media literacy. Like, don't get your news from one source. And it sounds like what you're asking is for more sources to get different perspectives on things. You mentioned a couple nonprofit news organizations that are relatively new. If you don't, check out Cal Matters they're not so new, but anyway. Check out Cal Matters they do a lot of statewide stuff, Sacramento type stuff. We republish their articles at KQED. They're great. You can also check out this is going to be about Oakland or Berkeley, but Oakland side, Berkeley side are solid, like hyper local in the best sense. News organizations that we both have past colleagues that work at. And I just wanted to encourage the idea of get your news from many places, including places that you might disagree with. I like checking places and reading articles from news organizations that I might feel like have, maybe a different political worldview than I might have personally. But I don't have this thing where I have to agree with what I read, right? I actually like the idea of getting a variety of perspectives and then putting that all together and coming up with what I think. I think that those of us who are making the pizza, that's what we have in mind for those who are eating the pizza. And I don't know if it's always understood kind of across that threshold there.
We have time for one final audience question, and then I have a wrap-up question after that.
When the Associated Press decided that they weren't going to refer to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America, they got evicted from the White House press corps. When legitimate press and media ask questions at news conferences that he holds, and Trump isn't shy about presenting himself before the press, they get shouted down, they get insulted, they get abused, and gradually my impression is that they're not asking the tough questions. They're not getting the follow-up questions. They're sitting there. These are opportunities, great opportunities for the press to ask pointed questions and get pointed answers and follow up when he gives this bullshit answers. And so my question is, what is your sense of the performance of the White House press corps?
You go first. I mean, that question is deep and layered, right? Because there's a lot there. I know long before the Trump administration, the White House press corps, in and of itself, those who attend the sort of daily press briefings given by either sometimes the president shows up, depending on the administration, whatever, but by the White House press secretary for sure, right? They can be looked down upon as somewhat, a practice in being a stenographer, right? That it's somewhat of a one-way channel of information. Yes, you can have a back and forth, a repartee, but at the end of the day, a press conference is a press conference, and that's not usually the place that you get the great, big, revealing information in the public interest. So that's one thing that we could say. You can't have one without the other, is my learning over time, right? That having somebody in the chair day in and day out, while that may not be in and of itself as sort of directly glorious as maybe a different approach, you need that person in that seat. And I think that that's what you're referring to, is that kind of daily practice of back and forth is really important, whether or not we want to otherwise kind of say, oh yeah, you're just the people that go to the press conference, right? Now, how is it going now? I think that now it's really challenging, and I've had this experience on a local level. You've had it with the president himself before he was president, right? But it is really difficult to deal with a bully, and I think that that's a lot of what the challenge is right now, because there's been a lot of different tries just by the industry. By the way, not all news organizations are like talking to each other and coming up with a unified plan, right? But there have been different things tried over time. I remember the first Trump administration, there were several prominent national journalists who would spar with him. And it became somewhat, there wasn't a lot of substance there. At some point it became not that useful.
Look, the work goes on outside of the press conferences. Take Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Context, historical understanding, putting things within that is a lot more important than going back and forth with Caroline What's-Her-Face, trying to show off for the TV cameras, right? I mean, it's just a press briefing, and you have to give the administration credit for being disciplined in the message of what he is attempting to do, if there's even a message there. I think the message generally is simply a portrayal of his supposed strength. right? And all you can do is go back and point out that, they didn't really have plans to tear down the entire West Wing, and then they did, right? You got to keep it, all they can do is keep it straight. Carl Bernstein's best definition of this is that news reporting is finding the most attainable version of the truth. The most attainable version of the truth does not come out of his mouth. Ever. Right? So there's so much work that goes on outside of 20 minutes in a cattle call, press briefing, filled with people who want to ask Vladimir Zelensky why he's not wearing a suit, rather than substantive questions about a horrible war. So, I think that the major news organizations, the major newspapers will hang through this.
And one last question.
Sure.
If you could change one thing about how society, American society, understands freedom of speech and freedom of the press, what would that be?
I think I've alluded to it. I am concerned about a move. This is not about any particular presidential administration now. This is more of a cultural or a societal issue. I have been concerned about a move toward seeing factual information as something to agree or disagree with. And so that would be what I would change. And I include, by the way, in terms of as in the definition of factual information, as someone else's opinion as well, right? In that I don't need to agree with it in order to be enlightened that it exists, or to have it test positions that I might hold, but then be exposed to some a counterpoint. I've been concerned for the past several years that there's been a move, I think, and we can trace, the origins of it to potentially the way that we consume information, the amount of information we're exposed to, as well as other kind of societal and cultural factors. But the end result gives me concern, because if we can't take an objective look at things and say, embrace a little bit of nuance, embrace a little bit of diversity of viewpoint, then I just feel like as a democracy, as a functioning democracy, we are cooked. So that would be my answer.
I will answer that, but let me go back to the previous thing about the White House press conferences and just offer this. Anybody remember the last time you saw Gavin Newsom on TV having a press conference? Anybody? He doesn't have them, right? And there's two reasons. He doesn't want to have them because he wants to control the message as strongly as the president wants to control the message, and is probably better at it because he's a more intellectual person than the president is. He's also not as pathological as the president is. But he doesn't have press conferences. He doesn't talk to the media. I haven't seen Gavin Newsom talk to the media since he was the mayor of San Francisco. I mean, in a room having a discourse with reporters over public policy. Just doesn't do it. Yet, the state seems to function. Probably not transparently enough. And he certainly positioned himself as the leader of the resistance. The one thing that changed for journalists have to be accepted and further accepted as an extremely necessary evil in a democracy. You don't have to like us, and I tell young reporters all the time that an attribute that they need to hone going into doing good, tough reporting is to not care about whether the people that they are dealing with in public life and public officials and mayors and school board presidents and governors like them or not, right? It's not about being liked. It's about doing a job. And I have a friend, and I wish she could, I think she was invited today from the First Amendment Coalition, Jenny LaRue, and she couldn't make it. And she would sit here and tell you that journalism is an act of patriotism. And I agree with her in saying that, not to throw reporters like Alex and I out there like we're, hard-charging, rah-rah American patriots. But not up there anymore. Oh, now it's back up there. That tells us to do something. That is the only occupation right there. Where's press? Where's the word press? Fifth line. That's the only occupation you're going to find in the Constitution, folks. The only occupation. You're not going to find that lawyers have a right to practice law. You're not going to find that school teachers have a right to teach. You're not going to find that truck drivers have a right to drive a truck. But that members of the press have a right to work without unfettered, in a way unfettered and uncontrolled by the government. Now, at the local level, that doesn't work real well sometimes. Our Public Records Act is broken. Public officials don't follow it, don't care about it, don't release things. Mayors don't return phone calls. They don't ask questions after meetings if there's a reporter to go to a meeting to ask a question. But in the end, we're doing that. And they put it there for a very important reason. Because try living without us, right?
And all those local officials that Tom just kind of referenced are also desperate for your vote. Just saying.
So, when the League of Women Voters has a forum for the next time that there's elections for the Fremont City Council, ask them how they're going to talk to reporters. Ask them how they're going to respond to media. Ask them, how does the city of Fremont do in compliance with the Public Records Act? How does the Fremont School District do with compliance with the Public Records Act? Public records, access to public records are vitally important to getting our job done. And it's not good in California right now.
It's real tough.
It's really bad.
All right. Wow. We've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? Well, I'm finished. Yeah.
Hi. We'd like to, we're running a little bit over time, but I think that this is important, so we're going to go ahead with it. Angelina is going to talk very briefly about what the League of Women Voters, the actions that the League has been taking regarding freedom of speech and freedom of the press.
Getting a little stiff there and concerned about the time, but a few things that I want to address that came out of this presentation was that this chapter utilizes the Tri-City Voice to advertise our programs, and many times it's free. On occasion we've had to publish, and it's about $400 to publish an announcement with color in the Tri-City Voice. But we do have an opportunity to provide articles regarding defending democracy, as we have been doing. We also have begun, and we're encouraging, as the gentleman announced, that we need an action group that attends council meetings, school board meetings, and you can do it online. So you can be at your home, comfortable, and report back to the league board about what's going on in your city. And we have Fremont, we have Newark, and we have Union City. In Newark, there is a Maori village that is proposed on property that's next to the wetlands, so there are concerns. And so we need to pay attention to that, and we also need volunteers. If you go to our website under resources, our most recent newsletter we have a young person as an editor, and she's doing a fantastic job. She's an editor, helps with her journalism at her school, Irvington High School. So we're pretty much blessed with folks who have stepped up to the plate to defend our democracy. So I want to also highlight 4 litigations that are current. So the first one is the League of Women Voters and its coalition. The law is called, or the lawsuit is called, the League of Women Voters versus Landry. And Landry is the Secretary of State for Louisiana. And it's challenging Louisiana's new law. So that's where we have to watch our laws that are being developed in the legislature. SB 436 in Louisiana requires proof of United States citizenship to register to vote. And yes, the league got involved right away, and it challenged that Senate bill because it unconstitutional in violation of the First and 14th Amendment. And it violated the due process clause. And when you talk about due process, we also talk about noticing. And the Brown Act for local agencies in California is so important because agendas must be posted 72 hours before a local meeting. And notices for public hearings for a development must be noticed within 10 days. And the only logical newspaper around our 3 cities is the Tri-City Voice. So now they are earning some money through advertising for the local agencies of their notices. So it's important sometimes to read those sections, even though there aren't any photos or advertisements. It's legal notices through the Tri-City Voice. So there were arguments against this Louisiana SB 436, and the goal of the lawsuit was to get the court ordered to prevent the state from enforcing that new proof of citizenship. And this happened went into effect January 1st of 2025. And we know that currently the National Voter Registration Act does not require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote. It just mandates that you are swear under penalty of perjury that you are a United States citizen. So the leaks and the lawsuit sent information, a 90-day waiting period. When nothing happened and no response, then the league went ahead and became co-plaintiffs with other campaign legal centers, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. So our situation on that is that now the court is asking for proof. Did it really harm a voter? And just October 29th, just a few days ago, there was a gentleman who works for a former House of Representatives in Louisiana, and she is now the tax assessor clerk. And she was able to send in as a declaration of this lawsuit that it is harming folks. And the reason is that in the cities where you go to get your license, the DMV, in that area, it's called the National Public Service. And the state, recently the state Secretary of State sent a purge list to this city, to this county, Travis County in Texas, and said all these folks need to get purged off. Well, when you look at the list, they were all registered by what they call, we call the DMV. So how could that happen? So there are questions. So this declaration now is part of this lawsuit, and it still continues. Another one is the AI robocall. And this occurred in 2024 in New Hampshire, and it was part of the presidential primary. And there was an AI voice, a robocall, that went to Democrats to save their vote for the general election don't vote this time around. And the calls also were falsely that voting in the primary would only enable the Republicans in their quest to elect Donald Trump again. And in this, the plaintiffs were asked to, and they intimidated and coerced our Democratic voters in their attempt. So they violated the Telephone Consumer Protection Act and the New Hampshire elections law, and asked that the court to issue a permanent nationwide injunction prohibiting the defendants from producing or distributing robocalls using AI-generated voice impersonations. The impersonator they were simulating President Joe Biden, asking folks not to vote in the primary to save their vote. The plaintiffs were the League of Women Voters of New Hampshire, the League of Women Voters of the United States, and various other voters. Against the defendants were Life Corporation and Voice Broadcasting Corporation. And the two parties in May were able to agree on something, and the agreement is that they do not facilitate the transmission of intimidating, threatening, or corrosive messages in connection with United States elections. So that was settled. The next slide is two more. Utah. There was in Utah in 2018, the voters passed Proposition 4, and it was involving Independent Redistricting Commission and banned partisan gerrymandering. That was in 2018, but in 2020, the Republican-controlled Utah legislature enacted SB 200, which made some very dramatic alterations to that ban. They repealed the ban on partisan gerrymandering, reduced the commission to an advisory level, allowing the legislature to draw its own gerrymandering districts and ignore the commission's proposal. In response, the league sued the state court, asserting that this bill and the new congressional maps were illegal under state law. So Amendment D eliminated the right of voters to reform the government with ballot initiatives by allowing the legislature to overturn and modify initiatives after they passed. And initiatives, as we know, are gathered by signatures from folks, and it's, as we know, initiatives are when signatures are submitted to the Secretary of State. In this instance, the legislator thought that they could overturn the people-driven initiatives. So the League of Women Voters filed a lawsuit in the 3rd Judicial District Court for Salt Lake County, and they asserted that Proposition 4 violated the Utah's Constitution, and also the second argument was that the legislature failed by state constitutional requirements, again, this is similar to our Brown Act, mandating the full text of a proposed amendment be published in at least one newspaper in each county where newspapers are published for 2 months leading up to the election. This requirement was not done. So the court struck down Amendment D, ruling that that summary would likely fail, even though the league tried to take it off the ballot. And the judge said, no, we're going to leave it on, but until we know if this is going to be appealed. It was appealed. However, the court ruled that the legislature had failed to follow the notice requirements for publishing the amendment required. And so the court allowed Amendment D to appear on the ballot to allow voters to vote on it, but if this decision was later overturned, but declared no votes for it would count unless its ruling were reversed. So Amendment D was null and void. The last one is SAVE. It's this HR 22. the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. The lawsuit is the League of Women Voters of the U.S. versus Department of Homeland Security. This is a class action case challenging the Trump-Vance administrator's creation of consolidated national databases of America's personal information for the purpose of identifying non-citizens and potentially purging eligible voters from registration rolls. And of course, the defendants are the United States Department of Homeland Security, the Social Security Administration, and the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. The federal agencies unlawfully consolidated, secretly, sensitive personal data, including Social Security numbers, medical records, tax information, without proper notice, violating the Privacy Act of 1974. So the relief is that the plaintiffs are seeking an injunction to stop the government from operating these data systems. The Social Security databases have inaccuracies, and it is well known. And the detention of unlawfully acquired data and require public disclosure of all data pooling details as mandated by the Privacy Act. The current status is that the lawsuit is still filed, and a preliminary injunction was filed on October 7th of this month. The case was stayed, temporarily halted by the court due to a lack of appropriations for government agencies during the government shutdown. So all things are still on hold on this save, and the League, in its efforts, if you go on the League website for the United States, you can find all of these, and much more information on this. But in Texas, for the November 4th election, just a few weeks ago, that office of Celia Israel, who was a former House of Representatives individual, is now the Travis County tax assessor collector, and they have submitted a declaration on this cause that this purge is harming voters' right to vote. So these are just a few of what the League is doing to defend our democracy. So we're grateful that also Cal Matters website was mentioned as well as for information on ballots or elections in other states. Ballotpedia is also a good reference to read and look for good, truthful, accurate information. So I want to thank everyone for coming today. I want to announce or say that on Monday, it's National Poll Worker Day. Now, how many of you were poll workers in your times? I mean, there's lots of hands. I remember I'm wearing a pin that the Alameda County Registrar of Voters used to give out pins to all its poll workers. And no, now it's not, poll workers aren't needed as much, so we tend to sit back and relax. But I can recall going to a civics class in the early mid-90s, I believe it was, and I took a little bottle, and in that bottle were Chads. And my title was, Chad is just not a boy's name. It's not just a boy's name. And I explained to the high schoolers that this is a Chad, and the poll workers are instructed to do such and such and such and such. Pull them off or push them back into that little hole. And so someday my kids are going to go in the garage and find this little jar of tiny little papers, and they're going to say, what is this? Why did she say that? Anyways, to Monday, celebrate the work you did, long 18 hours of working on those polling and all of the information they gave us. Plus, we had to carry all this stuff to set up the poll booth, and so now it's a little more convenient because of the all-mail ballots. But we welcome the new technology, and we can encourage our young people to continue to vote and send in their ballots. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for coming today. I want to thank our guests, Alex and Thomas, and our esteemed moderator, Dave. And I also want to say, if you like what you hear today, if you want to be involved in the League of Women Voter, please consider joining. We have these blue membership forms on the back table as you leave, and we would very much like to have you join the League and have a little something for our guests. We may not have a great local newspaper here in Fremont, but we have a fabulous coffee roaster, Suju's, okay? So you have a little Suju's. And is it true that journalists drink a lot of coffee? Okay. Okay, good. Thank you very much.